Hi, I'm Corey Walmsley, CEO of Aurora Coriolis Publishing, and today I wanted to talk about vulnerability and your writing. We've all been hearing the word vulnerability a lot lately, and for those of us who grew up hearing the word vulnerable, um, a little bit more than we hear vulnerability today, that can actually be where our brains go when we hear that term. Vulnerable to us doesn't mean being open-hearted, being easily accessible, letting our emotions be raw and real. It can sometimes mean that we are in danger, that we could be hurt. And for especially people who are empaths, I know that can be a challenge. So I want to make sure that first of all, when you think about using vulnerability in your writing and how powerful that is, that you think about vulnerability as an openness, a way of not being open to attack, but being open and okay with who you are, where you've been, your journey, your challenges, maybe things that you've had difficulty accepting yourself. But vulnerability is letting you do all of these things and be okay with making errors, making mistakes, being okay with moving forward. So vulnerability is this big thing that lets us connect with our readers. And there are a few pieces to the vulnerability that I'm going to talk about, because I know if you haven't done it before, if you haven't used vulnerability in your writing, then you may not necessarily know which direction to go. You might want a little bit, parameters around that. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. So the first thing with vulnerability is sinking into the darkness. And if your story involves something that is really heavy, really challenging, maybe even you felt judged for it before, then it might not feel okay to you to really sink into that darkness. You do need to allow yourself to dip in a little bit. The other end of it is, of course, when you are sinking in and staying there. You have to be very cautious about that, because you don't want people to have their energy all pulled down. You don't want somebody to start reading and be reading it just to get a peek at your story. You don't want them to be triggered by the story too, if they've been through something that was really challenging in a similar way. I know a lot of people have really difficult situations they've been through. So if you've been through something personally or professionally that was really emotional for you, be cautious about how long you stay in that darkness, but you do need to share the darkness. You need to let people know, hey, I've been there. If you're doing an article, for example, something a little bit shorter, couple sentences. If you're doing a book, it might be a little bit longer, a few paragraphs, maybe even a whole chapter talking about that darkness. But by and large, that is not all of your story. And you don't want people to think that that's all of your story. So if you're looking at it like a percentage wise, you want to make sure that it is a small percentage of your story. I don't even know that you want it to be 25%. It really depends on what kind of a story it is and how emotional it's going to be. But you don't want people's energy to stay in that dark, yucky place. You don't want people to feel drawn down. You want them to know that there is light at the end of the tunnel and that they can be uplifted. So the first part of that vulnerability, sink into that darkness a little bit. After that, you want to weave in the transformation. That's always the second step. You want to make sure that people understand that there were ups and downs, that you're a real person, that things can go well and then they can suck, and then they can go well and then they can suck. There is always an ebb and flow. And it ebbs and flows for a while. Sometimes it can ebb and flow for years. Transformation can take time, So you want to make sure that you weave that in. Make sure that they understand the different steps. You want people to see that you've been through some challenges. You want them to also celebrate your wins. So, no matter what the challenge is that you've gone through, you want them to see, hey, there are some really high points. And yeah, there are some points where it sucked, but there are mostly some high points, because I'm going through a transformation and I have a big goal at the end. After that, You want to stretch out that win. That's the next step in vulnerability. Stretch out the win, because being vulnerable doesn't mean just sharing those deep, dark emotions and just sharing that tough journey. It also means letting people celebrate with you. You want them to see, especially in a book, how wonderful it is at the end of the journey. Whether it's a personal or professional journey, there's always that like big, we finally made it at the end. Even if it's not a big win, like, if you've been through some sort of a medical journey and you're not cured per se, maybe you've just figured some things out and now it's easier. You want people to know that it can be easier. And there are a lot of different situations that could be applied to. You want them to know it can be easier. You want them to know it's doable. And you want to get them to go, okay, that's my goal down there. I can absolutely get to it. So those are the 3 steps to vulnerability in your writing: sinking into the darkness, weaving in the transformation, and stretching out the win. But what if you're feeling too vulnerable? Have you ever had that happen, where you start sharing your story and you get this feeling? Sometimes it's like in your gut, and you're just like, oh my God, I'm telling too much. I'm sharing too much. I don't feel good about this. You have to step back and honor that, first of all. Your body is telling you something, your brain, your heart, your gut, whatever it is that you're listening to, it's telling you something, and you need to listen. You need to make sure that you are ready to share that transformational journey, your vulnerability. So if you start feeling like you're being too vulnerable, there are a couple different things that could be causing that. One, you may not actually be ready to share that. There's a lot of healing, there's a lot of growth in all of our journeys. And if we haven't hit a point where we feel comfortable with all of it, then that can leave us feeling yucky. That can make us think, oh, I'm not quite ready to talk about this yet. Good example is if you've ever been through a relationship where somebody has broken up with you. Yeah, you still love them. Yeah, you might want to still call them. They don't want to talk to you. So you have to do a lot of processing on your end and be actually ready to, start dating again. You can't just be like, oh, well, that's done, and now I'm going to go out. You need to give yourself time. You need to give yourself grace. You need to give yourself permission to kind of mourn and get through that and be ready to move on. So whatever your journey is, if you're feeling that you're not quite ready to date again, kind of feeling, that's your signal to say, not ready to share that story. And that's okay. That's perfectly all right. You share the story when you are ready. The other end of it, if you're feeling like you're being too vulnerable, it could be that you just are dumping the whole story out. So if you feel like you're almost gossiping or just blurting things out, just trying to get it all out, that can give you a yucky feeling too. Like, oh my God, I just dumped all this stuff out. Well, lucky for you, you're writing, so you can delete or erase if you're handwriting. So make sure you understand too that this is a draft. You don't have to turn in anything. You don't have in most cases, you don't have a deadline. This is a draft. So when you are writing your story, if you get that, oh my God, I just dumped all this stuff out feeling, give it a little time, a couple hours, a couple days, whatever it takes, and then go back and look at it again. At that point, you can decide, do I feel better about it? Do I feel like this was too much? Is this what my reader needed to hear? And if you keep feeling yucky about it, then maybe it's number one, you're not quite ready to share. So just wanted to recap. First of all, if you're looking at vulnerability in your writing, if this is a tool you want to use, one, sink into the darkness, but don't stay there. You want to keep going with number two, weaving in that transformation and making sure that people understand that you are a real person and not a robot that just goes, I'm done, moved on to the win. Because nobody wants to read about a non-real person. It really doesn't help us feel like we're connecting with you. And then finally, three, stretching out that win, helping people just live in this glorious state of fantasticness that you've got at the end of your story. So vulnerability is the number one way of connecting with your audience. And I want to make sure that you do have these tools in place, that you can use them. If you're thinking about writing a story, if you've been working on a book and you want some help, absolutely reach out to me. Let's talk about your story. Let's talk about vulnerability. Let's talk about helping you get it written and get it published and get it out to the world so you can start making a much bigger impact and make the change that you want to see.